One more minute. Going.
Right now, we're staying. Trying to get off. Yeah, that's good.
Apparently something is good. All right, we're getting ready to start. And then, I think.
All right, I think we're gonna be in good shape here. For the people on Zoom, one more minute, and we'll be right with you. Oh,
We have one more.
oh,
Come on, let's take it. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jane Vanderhagen, and welcome to the October San Diego ACS Speaker Series program. I'm excited to be here.
it all goes to hell. Back with-
1 second. We might be.
Thank you,
We,
thank you.
we don't want anybody to trip on a cord. Okay. Anyways, welcome. I'm going to just say a little bit of information on what's coming up in our chapter, and then I will introduce our speaker, and we'll get this rolling. So on November 12th, we will have a Zoom-only presentation by Ted Cheeseman. So he's a co-founder and director of Happy Whale, which is a research collaboration and citizen science web platform. So I hope you're able to join us. He's going to be presenting new science of curious migratory patterns among California's humpback whales. So mark that on your calendar, but Zoom only. Don't show up here. It'll be lonely.
Unless you want to come early for lobster and then go back home and do Zoom.
There won't be any lobster here, so we're good.
No,
Okay.
over there.
And then in December, we're dark. So I hope everyone enjoys that month.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, just in December. And then in January, we just finalized Stephen Swartz. He was also going to be presenting, but he will be presenting from San Ignacio Lagoon. So again, it's going to be a Zoom only. He has a new book called Touched. And it's going to be, well, the book talks about the history of the lagoons and all of its ups and downs and what everyone's had to go through to keep these lagoons. So I hope you're able to attend that one. It should be really interesting.
That'll be Zoom as well.
Yeah, Zoom only. And then as always, the San Diego chapter is busy kind of looking at putting together a program that best suits our membership's needs. So in the next couple of weeks, a survey is going to be coming out. And if you would please complete it, it's going to be quick. We're looking at, how many programs do you want? Do you want to have different types of activities? What are you looking for? Do we need to be more scientific? Do you want something, more light? Just give us some ideas on what we can do to better serve you and spread any information and of course education. So that again will be in a couple of weeks. And we're always looking for volunteers. So reach out to Jennifer or Leanne or Pam or anybody.
Particularly web skills.
Yeah, I was just to say, particularly right now, we need some help. We're rebuilding our website. It's not fast, but so anything, anyone that has skills in that, we'd really be happy to have you join us. And let's see, I think that's it. So our speaker. So with a topic and actions that are heartbreaking, our speaker will reveal the history that shows how Soviet whalers secretly helped to nearly destroy endangered whale populations, while also contributing to the scientific understanding necessary for these creatures' salvation. In this new account, based on formerly secret Soviet archives and interviews with ex-whalers, our speaker offers a complete history of the role the Soviet Union played in the whale's destruction. Please help me welcome Ryan Tucker Jones, Anne Swindle's professor of history at the University of Oregon and author of 2 books. One, I messed that up. One of the books includes The Empire of Extinction, and he will be presenting tonight the Red Leviathan, The Secret History of Soviet Whaling.
Is it all right if I minimize these people here who are joining in? Can I do that?
I will put that in the chat room.
Just because I've got a couple of images here.
All right. Can people here, okay?
Does that work?
In the chat? I mean, in the Zoom?
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for that kind introduction. As was mentioned, I'm an historian who's really interested in whales. I imagine many of you are very interested in whales as well. I've been working on a new book recently, which is a much larger kind of history of humans and whales. And in the process, I've been down to San Diego a few times looking at the Ray Gilmore collection. I've talked to Rick Matthews a few times about the long and really important history of the American Cetacean Society. I just became a member last year, so I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, awesome.
Yes, fantastic. So I'm super delighted to be talking to you from a boat here today. This is only the second time I've ever presented on a boat. The first time was actually in St. Petersburg on an old Soviet icebreaker where I gave a talk in Russian. It was horrible. It was really, really bad. It's going to be better tonight. So really excited. I figure that I'm talking to people who probably know a little bit about this story already. I mean, I know we have at least 2 filmmakers in here who know a lot about this story. In fact, I met them while I was conducting research in Kaliningrad. So what I decided to do and given the society's familiarity and important role in whale science itself, I decided to focus tonight really on Soviet whale scientists, cetologists. So I'm going to be talking about Soviet cetology. And it strikes me, I gave a similar talk up at the University of Washington at the Fisheries Science Department a couple of months ago. It strikes me that, from my perspective at least, unfortunately, we live in a world, and science is operating in a world today that bears some unfortunate resemblance to the world that Soviet scientists worked in, as well, a world in which the government dictated large portions of what could and could not be said, what could and could not be researched. And for that reason, actually, I wrote this book, came out in 2022, but I'm finding some new resonance in it, especially in the story of these scientists, which I think is really interesting because they, under some of the most difficult conditions, I think that scientists have faced in the modern world, in some ways, I'm going to explain why I think that, produce some of the most interesting science, and they've worked in really clever ways, not always successfully, but super creatively, to bring us new knowledge about whales, knowledge which we're still benefiting from, building on, even though it's very poorly known in the United States and the rest of the West. Okay, so Soviet cetology and the destruction of the world's whales. I don't know about you, but when I think about Soviet whaling, and certainly when I first started writing this book, this was the image. This I guess there's a bit of a lag here. This was the image that came to mind, not the image of my book. The image, you probably know it. Greenpeace, 1975, a few hundred miles north of where we are right now, protesting out on the open sea against, this is the Soviet whale ship, the Danya Vostok, the Far East. It was catching sperm whales, including undersized sperm whales in 75. And, the Greenpeace activists drove their Zodiacs between the whale catcher and the sperm whales. And famously, there was a TV footage of a harpoon going over their head and striking a sperm whale. Many people consider this sort of the birth of the modern environmentalist movement. It was certainly sort of the beginning of the end of Soviet whaling. I grew up in California, and this this moment always struck me, especially when I moved to Russia and started becoming a Russian historian and thinking, I couldn't help but think like, who are these people? Who were these people in this boat? Like, well, why were they there? What were they doing? Greenpeace, we kind of know that story, but what about the Soviet side here? Well, that's part of the story that I'm going to unpack, and I'm going to return to one person who was on this boat this day, a very well-known in the Soviet Union, at least scientist, named Alfred Berzin, probably then the world's top expert on sperm whales. And the story that I'm going to tell, the story that I discovered as I researched in Russian archives, was that it is a very complex group of people here, some of whom actually probably agreed with what Greenpeace was doing. And then, of course, there's the other side too, that Greenpeace actually had no idea how bad things actually were, what they were protesting. I'm going to explain a little bit of both of that. Okay, but I'm going to go back. I'm going to take you back. Since I always tell my students in Soviet history, we have to understand what happened before the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. I'm going to be very quick, but just to say that there was a long tradition in Russian science, in particular, of what we might think of as holistic thinking about the natural world. There are Russian scientists, people like Vladimir Stanchinsky, were famous for devoting serious attention to the study of ecosystems, something he called biocenosis, biocenosis. This is the Russian word for biocenosis, which is the study of the way that energy flows through ecosystems. He was important in establishing what we might think of as nature parks in Russia. They call them zapovedniki. That means to be put aside. And this was a big movement before the Bolshevik Revolution of really setting aside places to study, to figure out how ecosystems work, etc. Another important figure was a guy by the name of Pyotr Kropotkin. I don't know if you know of Kropotkin, but Kropotkin was famous for modifying, challenging Darwin's idea of survival of the fittest. Kropotkin, in his study in Siberia, he was a revolutionary, he was a socialist, a kind of proto-communist. He was convinced that actually nature was not just about competition, it was also about mutual aid. He wrote a book called Mutual Aid in Natural Selection, that actually in many cases organisms work together. It's a controversial amendment to Darwin, but my point that I want to make here is that Russian science was full of super interesting, creative, challenging, iconoclastic ideas. It led to real changes in Imperial Russia. And what did the Soviets do with that science? They totally embraced it. Totally embraced it, because this was, they felt, the promise of communism. All right. First of all, that for the first time, instead of capitalist destruction of the natural world, which they saw all around them, the state was going to control everything. I mean, the people via the state were going to control everything. And therefore, you could actually rationally plan for the first time. You could use things like Stanchinsky's idea of biocenosis to figure out, okay, energy is flowing through an ecosystem. How much can we take out of it without fundamentally altering it? So there were some really progressive ideas. I mentioned one, Zapovednik, that's a nature park established in the Russian Far East. This is the part of the world I'm talking most about today. 1934, right? This is Joseph Stalin already. Stalin takes over in the late 20s. He continues to establish nature parks, places, set aside to study the natural world that humans shouldn't touch. Okay, I just want to establish that this was at least this was one of the central goals of communism. It was to forge a new relationship with nature as well as between humans. Of course, there we go. Okay. Of course, there are competing strands, like as there were everywhere in the world. I just show you a couple of examples. The creation of a bunch of different institutes under the Soviet Union. This is a place called Tinro. That's the Pacific Ocean Institute, Fisheries and Oceanography. This was established in the 1930s as well. The one over there is the Moscow Central Branch of Fisheries and Oceanography. And these were places, you basically devoted to increasing the catch of fish primarily, devoting, turning science towards making the natural world more productive for humans. I mean, after all, the goal of communism wasn't for everyone to be poor, right? It was for everyone to be wealthy. In the end, to do that, the only way you could do it was really increase the yields, especially in cases of these institutes of the ocean, from the ocean. Most of the scientists I'm going to talk about come out of these institutes, and so they were very much dedicated, as are many of our scientists, especially at the same time, right, to increasing production out of the oceans. At the same time, this is the Academy of Sciences, one of, I don't know, depends on your taste, one of the ugliest buildings in all of Moscow, one of the most beautiful. I lived not that far from there, and I don't know. I think every day I woke up with a different opinion of it. It's like, looks like you could plug it in to a wall socket. It's interesting, let's just say. And the Academy of Science represented this opposite trend in Soviet science, the idea that this sort of holistic study of the natural world for the natural world's sake, just to understand how does our Earth work. That kind of study was centered in the Academy of Sciences, and it had a competing voice in, for example, how to deal with whaling. Okay, so that brings us, you've been waiting for whales. Here they are. Russia, you want to read about, here they are in just a second. Russia, if you want to read about Russia's history of whaling before the Soviet Union, it's a brief chapter in my book because it wasn't very long. Really, modern Russian whaling started in Joseph Stalin's second five-year plan in 1932, and it started out of the Siberian, or what Russians would call the Far Eastern port of Vladivostok. Just a little ways across the ocean over there. And Vladivostok is an interesting place, I think sort of meaningful for this history, because it was a place with a long, the Russian Far East was a place with a history of a long history of environmental destruction, mostly by Americans. There were a lot of American whalers in that area in the 19th century, and people who came from that area, like the first Russian whale scientist who wrote this book, Around the World for Whales. Sorry, it's so small. It's Zinkovich. They had a specific kind of environmental sensibility. Russians had actually incorporated pretty progressive environmental measures to try to fix the damage that, for example, the hunt for fur seals had caused, mostly by Americans and Canadians in the 19th century. They'd really preserved these resources. And Zinkovich, who, as I said, sailed on that first voyage, was very conservation minded. So 1932, this is how modern whaling is conducted, as you probably know, with a stern slipway, so you can kill a whale with a catcher ship, tow it back to the mothership, and then drag it up this slipway to be processed on deck. This is the first time the Soviets had joined this. It was really only invented in the 1920s. So Zinkovich, I want to focus on him for a second. This is not him. I don't have a picture of him at the time, but this is another Soviet scientist later on. You can see he's performing what another historian, here we go, has called hip-booted science. That is like, science when you're up to your waist in blood and guts. And that's precisely like how whale science was being done in the 1930s, really up until the 1970s in some ways. And Zinkovich very much, part of this. He's mucking around on board. He's pulling fetuses out of mothers. He's measuring them. He's sexing them. Not difficult in this case. He is observing them with, of course, the mandate of like Soviet Union needs to start catching a lot of whales to feed people. It's a whole other story. Didn't work out exactly, but so one way, scientists like Zinkovich, whose book is really marvelous, by the way, were totally part of this. Like, let's catch as many as we possibly can. On the other hand, he was dealing with living in dead whales every day of his life. Certainly while he was working on the Alliot, which he did for about a decade, he became a very attendant observer of whales and their behavior in ways I would argue that actually not a lot of scientists had the chance to do. And it wasn't that common for scientists to be on board whale ships at the time. Soviet Union was unique because it was all run by the government. They put scientists on board every whale ship. So Soviet scientists had sort of unique opportunities to really observe whale behavior in a different way. Zinkovich, these are a couple pictures from his book. You'll, I think, recognize both species as soon as they appear. One is a sperm whale.
For some reason, a lag.
Yeah, just a bit. Wait for them. Wait, there they are. Okay, sperm whales over here. Anyone know what the other species is? Gray whales, yeah, exactly. You'll recognize, I mean, everyone in San Diego knows what a gray whale looks like, I would think, right? Well, this is one of the main species that they were hunting in the 1930s. They were not protected then. In fact, they were just sort of starting to bounce back after the slaughter of the 19th century. Those, well, we don't know for sure, right? Probably a mixture. This is, as this caption says, by the way, this is gray whales off the coast of Chukotka. There are at least some eastern Pacific gray whales that go to Chukotka, probably quite a few. So Zinkovich out there studying these whales, and he noticed in 1936, so just 4 years later, that the average size of the gray whales they were catching was getting smaller and smaller. And he told planners, we got to stop catching gray whales. And they listened to him. All right, no more gray whales, or at least we'll try not to. Soviet gunners were not that experienced. They still killed some, but they weren't given bonuses for killing gray whales. This was the sort of Soviet science in action. I mean, this is like government observers on board, able to tell the company, the state company, when you've got to stop, and they actually listen to that. Later that year, catching gray whales would be banned internationally by other countries as well, because their population was indeed crashing. Now, Zinkovich, said other things. I've got a quote here. It's probably too small anyway in this space, but just to say, he had a pretty emotional relationship to whales. He describes here, seeing a mother whale just sort of sit placidly by while her baby was killed. She refuses to leave it, just let herself get killed as well. And he was really actually pretty upset by this sort of thing. They clearly had a kind of emotional response too. And this fed into another of the real concerns of Soviet science. They were very interested, like Kropotkin had been, in altruism. If you think about it for a second, maybe it makes sense why. They're trying to create a society in which people are no longer ruthlessly competing against each other, right? And as the capitalist countries do, but rather trying to work together for mutual benefit, right? And so scientists like Zinkovich found it very interesting that some whales at least seem to demonstrate that kind of behavior. So at a time in the 1930s when most Western scientists were running away from any kind of sense that animals had intention, and they were very much going down this behavioralist turn. Everything's just a natural response, etc. Russians were really interested in the kind of social, emotional, and intelligence of whales. And so producing some really pretty interesting science. A lot of them were studying clay and captive dolphins at the same time. I'll give you one last example before I move on, because this is pretty interesting. He actually was, I guess, maybe the second Soviet whale scientist, a guy by the name of Evgeny Grigorievich Tamilin. He later became sort of famous in the Second World War because he had a real way with animals. You can see him here also working with captive dolphins. He actually trained dogs to carry bombs underneath Nazi tanks and then blow themselves up under these tanks. So obviously killing the dog, but saving a human life, hopefully in the process while resisting the Nazi invasion that came in 1941. Well, Tamilin had been working in the Russian Far East before, and then he went to work in the Black Sea, where there was so in the Far East, he was really interested in the way that whales communicated with each other, and he started noticing that, like, if you harpoon a humpback whale, he thought at least he could hear other whales from a long ways away trumpeting, coming together to try to aid a wounded whale. And he thought, whales must be communicating in some way. And he really became convinced of this when he started studying dolphins in the Black Sea. There was a totally ruinous hunt for dolphins, just absolutely disastrous in the 30s. And Tamilin was studying them, and he described in this one paper that I read how you would net the dolphins, right? And you can imagine you net a bunch of dolphins from a pod, and it's just total chaos. Dolphins are just jumping out of the water, they're rushing towards the net. And what he noticed was that somehow mother dolphins would find their baby dolphins trapped in the net. Mother would be outside, the baby inside, and they would locate each other. And he thought, there must be some distinct form of communication between these pairs of animals to allow them to do this. It's not visual. It must be audible. This is what scientists would later call signature whistles in the, I think, the 1980s, when they really came upon this insight. Tamilin was talking about this in the 1930s. What I find is interesting, what's one of the most famous moments in history that probably all of us know is like Roger Payne's recording of humpback sounds, right? And this was like, oh my God, whales make these beautiful noises. We have to save them. Tamilin had a different response. Tamilin, I'll give you the quote here. If we imitate the signals which elicit responses from this or that species of dolphins or made by wounded whales, clearly these sounds can attract corresponding animals towards the hunting boats. In other words, hey, if we learn to speak whale, think how easy whaling will be. We'll just call these things right to the boat. So, okay, I'm trying to convince you that Soviet whale scientists had pretty sophisticated, interesting, in some ways modern views towards whales, but they were never divorced, of course, from the ultimate goal of the state at that time, very much to increase hunting. Okay, well, things did change in the Soviet Union. The whaling fleet massacred by Stalin's purges in 1937, when about 1 million members of the Communist Party were executed, including many of the members of the Aleut fleet. This was the captain, a man by the name of Alexander Ignatievich Dudnik. He was thrown in prison, accused of trying to sabotage Soviet whaling in favor of the Japanese. A bunch of crazy stuff. Dudnik actually survived, amazingly, but most people died. Simkovich survived, and he'll make another appearance in this talk. But that is to say, it was a dangerous place to do anything. The Soviet Union had a long and continuing history of violence that impacted whalers as well. And a real turning point for Soviet science happened with the elevation of this man by the name of Trofim Lyshenko, who was a fairly poorly educated biologist who really found favor with Stalin because he promised Stalin that he held the secret to really unlocking the Soviet Union's economic, especially agricultural potential. And he was appointed head of the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1940. And Lyshenko basically believed in what we might call the Markian evolution, the idea that you can acquire new traits in the course of your lifetime and pass them on to your successors, your children, right? So classic story of elephants, reaching for the trees with their trunks grow longer, and then their children have longer trunks. Some science which was discredited in the West, although it's making a bit of a comeback with epigenetics, but became gospel in the Soviet Union after Lysenko's rise. And this is the kind of atmosphere in which Soviet scientists after the Second World War had to operate. So Lysenko and his brand of evolution reigned supreme at the very same time that Soviet whaling got much, much larger. So after the Second World War, the Soviets acquired a whale ship, was a German whale ship, a Nazi whale ship, the Slava. They went to the Antarctic. So that was where lots and lots of whales were. It's where the center of modern whaling really was. They joined the International Whaling Commission in 1946. Here you can see this is the Antarctic. Of course, this says hello from the Antarctic. You've got the icebergs. You've got the penguins watching them catch whales there in the Antarctic. So Soviets really expand into the modern arena of whaling at the same time that their science is coming under extreme pressure from the very top. Okay, and I'll just tell you quickly about two scientists and how they responded to this. First was a guy by the name of Makar Mitrofanovich Sleptsov. There he is. I don't know much about Sleptsov. He was a pretty cagey figure. He apparently had a wicked sense of humor. That's one of the few things I could find out about him. And I'll tell you a couple of his jokes because he did embed some of them in his book. He worked in a place called the Kuril Islands. The Kurils are north of Japan. The Soviets had just taken them from Japan in the Second World War, and they had taken the Japanese whaling stations as well. Here's one of them. I think this is on Paramushur. Sleptsov was there studying sperm whales and the Kuroshio Current, and he clearly just really loved being in this place. But what he didn't like was he was tagging sperm whales to see where they migrated to, and he would tag them one day, and the catcher boats would kill them the next day. And he was like, okay, I know they traveled about 20 miles. That's really not good science. That's really not helping me out. So they were being just basically killed as fast as he could mark them. This was part of a really major expansion. Now, okay, permit me a quick detour here. One of the things, this whaling station and many other whaling stations were destroyed in a tsunami in 1952, one of the biggest tsunamis the world's ever seen. Top secret, though, because this was right on the Soviet military border. In fact, they never even mentioned it in the Soviet press. No one knew that this had happened. Probably 100, out of 300 people who worked at this whaling station, 82 survived. So over 200 people died at this whaling station. If you look it up in Russia, you get these pictures. Here's one which claims to be an image of a blue whale being washed ashore by a tsunami. I find it amazing how it got washed up onto the Flimsing deck. This is like, how did that happen? This poor thing, it didn't get caught, but somehow the tsunami washed it right up to the whaling station. I'm just saying there's some misinformation here. This is a theme. This connects, I promise you. Here's a picture I got of the tsunami itself. It's obviously, it came in the middle of the night. Right? This tsunami came in, this is why so many people died, right? It came in the middle of the night. Anyway, a lot of legend, etc., surrounds this very mysterious tsunami. No one to this day knows how many people died. It's pretty interesting. A lot of misinformation. And Sleptsov was himself in 48 was working in an era of misinformation in the Soviet Union. Not only did you have to adhere to Lysenko's ideas about evolution, but you had to praise everything Russian. This was after they just won the Second World War. It was a time of intense patriotism called the anti-cosmopolitan time. So I find it very interesting that Sleptsov published the very first book for Russians about whales. It's called Giants of the Ocean. Here you go, Giganti Okeanov. You can see an epic battle with a sperm whale. He publishes this, and it's a strange book for the time. First of all, one thing I almost burst out laughing as I was reading this book. No idea what to expect when I first opened it. And he goes through this long history, as he says, of 1,000-year slaughter of whales. And one of the examples he says is not just whales, but what about the Steller sea cow? right? You've heard of stellar sea cow. I wrote my first book on stellar sea cow. That was the Empire of Extinction, killed by Russian fur traders in 1768, the last sea cow. He says in this book, it's a shame, but Americans and Norwegians killed off the sea cow.
Yeah.
How did Norwegians get to the North Pacific in the 18th century? It's totally insane. But that's kind of what you had to write. That was the sort of insanity that had taken over the Soviet Union in 1940. I had to see, as I got to know Sleptsov more through his writings, this was a beautiful joke. He was like, okay, you want me to say crazy things? I'm going to say some really crazy stuff in this book, and people who know, they'll know. This was what Soviets called Aesopian language, speaking through fables, speaking through misdirection, saying something when you actually meant something different altogether. And that's throughout this book in 1940. And I want to point to one specific example. First of all, look, Stalin's imagining reshaping the earth, reshaping the Soviet Union, because Lysenko has promised him, we just have to train our crops and they won't care about drought anymore. Sleptsov has a very negative point of view. Whales are really being killed and have been killed for a long time in far too large numbers. Okay, I'm just going to ask for close attention for a second, because it took me a while to understand what Sleptsov himself was saying here. He said, whales, they're really skittish. They avoid humans as much as possible. Why? It's because they're capable somehow of remembering danger, or so to speak, possess conditioned reflexes. In Russian, it's called suslovnye refleksy. The experience accumulated through centuries fixes itself in the nervous system of the animals and gets inherited. What is that? That is Lysenkoism. Exactly. That is the idea that these whales have been so traumatized by centuries of being hunted that they've actually changed at the genetic level. Did Sleptsov believe that? I have no idea. Did he use Lysenko to say something exactly the opposite of what Lysenko wanted, of what people wanted to hear? Yes, he absolutely did. He turned these ideas on their head to warn something. We might be able to change the world, but we might not be changing it the way that we want to. I'll give you one more example, and then I will start coming to the conclusion here. Another man by the name of, that's not Sleptsov, this is Klumov, who wrote a paper called On the Locality of Whale Paws. It might seem super, super minor and not that interesting at the beginning. But what Klumov said, and he was known to be kind of an anti-Soviet. He was totally disagreed with Lysenko. Klumov wrote a paper talking about, can whales easily, say, like cross the equator? Can a southern right whale go into the northern hemisphere? Can a southern hemisphere humpback go into the northern hemisphere? And he said no. You know why? Because Lysenko's right. If your father and your mother lived in the southern hemisphere, well, they evolved. They got used to living in the southern hemisphere, and you can't just change that. That gets inherited in your genes. The fact that your mother knew the routes of the southern hemisphere means that you inherited that, and you can't go to the northern hemisphere. Why was that important? Because it struck exactly against the heart of what others were saying, which is that, look, we might be killing too many whales in this one spot. Other whales will just come from somewhere else. It might, they'll just migrate in. In other words, there's a global stock of whales. It might look like there are too few here, too few there, but we got to keep the whole picture in mind. Klumov is saying, no, Lysenko tells us actually that animals are very specific to their environment. Again, using the kind of pretty insane science that he had to use to say just the opposite. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that there was, Soviet scientists were creatively talking about whales in ways that seemed to conform, but in fact pushed back in different ways. Well, Stalin died in 1953, and his place was taken by Nikita Khrushchev. Here you see, right here. And Khrushchev got rid of Lysenko, opened up debate, but redoubled the focus on economic production. And so, he made the claim, look, we're going to catch up with the United States in 5 years. And a key part of his platform was 1956. So I'm glad I'm here amongst a bunch of whale people and not a bunch of Russian historians, because I think you'll agree with me about this point. Okay, 1956 is a famous year in Soviet history. In fact, this meeting that I'm about to tell you about is one of the most famous moments, because it was when Khrushchev got up in front of the other members of the Communist Party and said, I have a horrible secret to tell you, Stalin was wrong about everything. And he shouldn't have killed everybody. Sorry, we're going to do things differently now. This was so-called secret speech. He gave the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956. Who cares about that? The important thing is, at that same conference, he announced the building of 7 new whaling fleets. That's what we should remember from 1956. And this, by the way, was at a time when the British were starting to sell their whaling fleets, when the Norwegians were starting to consider it. What had clearly happened in the post-war world was what Sleptsov was talking about. There was a huge rush. Whales were being slaughtered in record numbers. People had thought, hey, we're going to do it better with the IWC. No, didn't work. Right? Blue whales, probably in 1956, may have been down to a few hundred individuals in the southern hemisphere, in Antarctica. So crazy idea to build 7. What do we imagine that Soviet scientists had to say about this? Well, I can tell you, and I can tell you it's the people that we just looked at. Here is what Klumov said. Don't do it. It's not going to work. It's not going to be profitable from an economic point of view. We have Zinkovich, remember him from the Allied. He was still around. Total extinction under the existing rules and regulations is inevitable. Don't do it, said Zinkovich. Sleptsov said radical measures to conserve the remains of these North Pacific sperm whales should include the total banning of their catches. Nothing could have been more opposite to Khrushchev's plans. I include one more of someone you haven't met, a graduate student a little earlier, who just said it so beautifully. The continuation of whaling with such intensity could lead in the future to disastrous results. Whales bring humans such great benefits. They deserve for humans to take care of them and protect them from destruction. In other words, in a sense, Soviet science worked, right? The state asked them, what should we do? Is this sustainable? They said no, absolutely not. So Khrushchev built, it's coming, 5 new whaling fleets. He built 7, but he built 5, including the 2 largest the world had ever seen, the Sovietskaya Ukraina and the Sovietskaya Russia. And of course, they found exactly what the scientists had predicted, which is that the whale numbers were simply not there. What they decided to do in response was to target humpback whales. There was supposed to be a 4-day season on humpbacks. They, from 1961, 1963, targeted the humpbacks in so-called Region 5, south of Australia. And this part of the story may be fairly well known to you. They killed, there's the penguins again. In 1960, they killed 11,770 humpback while reporting 720 to the International Whaling Commission. Following year, 9,000, reporting about 300. And over the course of the next really 5 or 6 years, fair to say, dealt nearly a death blow to most of the large whales, also in the North Pacific, but especially in the Antarctic. As capitalist whalers got out of it, communist whalers and the Japanese increased their efforts illegally by the treaties that the Soviet Union had signed. So these are figures you can easily find in Yulia Vashenko and Phil Clapham's work. This was the sort of scale of illegal catches in the Antarctic, which was quite large across large numbers of species. So look, in some ways, obviously Soviet scientists failed. They were confronted with the state, which supported them, but also in the end purported to listen to them, and in the end, possessed all the power, and they didn't have it no matter what kind of ways they tried to find to get around what was wanted from them. But I'll just conclude on a slightly positive note. There were those again. People that Yulia and Phil talk about quite a bit, who continued to keep accurate records. This is why we know there were so many illegal catches. This is a man by the name of Yuri Mikhailov over there on my far left, and Dmitry Tormasov. Tormasov, as a young man on a whaling expedition, kept the true records of all of these catches, including the sizes, species, etc., and then revealed them after the end of the Soviet Union. Mikhailov consistently complained to Soviet authorities about this illegal whaling. It must be said mostly because his science was no good, because he couldn't print the correct numbers. And that really bothered him. And then there are people like Alexei Yablokov in the Academy of Sciences who really organized a pretty concerted opposition to Soviet illegal whaling. Yablokov's the very tall man there in the center with the big beard. He would later go on to be the founder of Greenpeace in the Soviet Union, and economic advisor to environmental advisor to Gorbachev and Yeltsin. There he is as an older man. And then finally, so he was very much involved, letter after letter I could see in the archives, him writes that we got to stop doing this. We got to stop doing this. One more, I'll tell you, just in with two more guys. Tamilin, you remember him, right? The guy with the dolphins. Let's speak dolphins so we can kill them more. Well, in 1974, he had completely changed his mind. He published what many Soviet cetologists consider the Bible of marine mammalogy in the world of whales and dolphins, Mirikitov Delfinov, in which he advocated publicly for a 50-year halt on whaling, just a year before Americans would call for a 10-year moratorium at Stockholm in 1975, which was finally realized at the 1982 International Whaling Commission meeting. And then I'll leave the last word to Berzin. Alfred Berzin, who in 1971 said, if the violations are not stopped, it will be a straightforward explanation for the extinction of the largest animal on the planet, and thus will be one of the greatest crimes of mankind. And Berzin was on that ship, the Dolny Vostok, that the Greenpeace activists had protested in 1975, looking down on them, possessing this knowledge of a long history of some successes, many evasions, lots of interesting, fascinating Soviet science, and of course, an ultimate failure to stop the destruction of the world's whales. I'll end there.
Well, thank you. Last with the questions. Yeah, Evan, maybe to turn the lights back on. You can stop sharing if you don't mind.
I do not mind.
And we will wait for all that to take place. Excellent. Then I am going to get fancy here and I'm going to switch my. Now look at that. We're going to be able to actually see you now. There we go. Look at that. Handsome. I will pin him.
I'm ready for my beer now.
Yeah, we're going. All right. So questions from both the Zoom. Zoom doesn't have any. Is there a question? Okay.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Super interesting. I didn't know anything about these scientists.
I didn't either when I started. Yeah.
You said that they were able to speak their minds. They were able to give the science as they understood it, at least in the later part of the century. Were they persecuted in any way?
Yeah, I mean, information was definitely suppressed. So, the Soviet Union, like every country, they had ups and downs in terms of information suppression. Those years, especially after the Second World War, between 1948 and Stalin's death, really till 1956, right? Where that was, the beginning of the Cold War. That was the most repressive period for scientists, when you really couldn't almost not even have contact with scientists from the rest of the world. That pressure significantly eased after 1956, but no one was still allowed to publish figures of illegal whaling. I mean, for obvious reasons, right? Because they were trying to keep the secret, and so that information was suppressed. And that was for some scientists was morally outrageous, right? Like Yablokov, and for others it was just sort of it was kind of ruining their careers too, right? Like they had a lot of interesting information on right whales, which were forbidden. Right whales have been forbidden to kill since what 1946, earlier 1936, and the Soviets were killing them in the and so they were getting really rare sex, data on population composition, and they were like, I want to publish this. They couldn't, obviously, because they would reveal that they'd been killing these protected species.
Kept the information.
They did.
These-
They did.
these-
Some of them did, yes. And
We'll go
and
there and then go
and,
there.
and I'll be clear, there were some scientists who were just like totally on board with the government, and completely supportive, and we're happy to lie about the data.
This is kind of related
Yeah.
in many ways. Thank you very much for your talk. You talked at the very beginning about how the post-Bolshevik Soviet reunion
Yeah.
bears some resemblance to 2025 United States. What advice would you give scientists who are feeling pressured, conservationists who are feeling silenced today?
Rick said this was being recorded. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, well,
Yeah, we are recording.
she's. Oh no, I think I'm joking. But I'm struggling to find good advice at the same time. I mean, I should say I'm not a scientist, right? I'm a historian, although we're under similar pressures. Maybe not as acute, right? Well, I don't know. That's
The
debatable.
rewriting of history.
Yeah, absolutely the rewriting of history is happening.
Yeah.
Certain topics are not funded,
Yeah.
anymore. So it impacts the humanities as well as or the social sciences as well as the natural sciences. I mean, I'm trying to think if there's a lesson. I mean, in the long run, these I'm remembering them. I feel like, Sleptsov, for example, was some guy I'd never heard of, was quite well known at the time, right? I think his sort of like it took me a while to understand what he was saying. Yeah, but I felt like he was able to say it in some way, right? The message still comes through. He was there for some of the worst things that were going on. It was very difficult for him in 48 to say anything. And yet I think he still had a message for posterity. Like I didn't agree with this. There were people who didn't go along with it. He encoded those messages. I mean, not particularly well. I think that was his intent, right? To write things that were so ludicrous that you could see what he was actually going to say. I don't know if I would suggest that path exactly, but I guess just I felt like that there was something of value in him, finding the means, right, to say like not everyone thinks this way.
Thank you.
Yeah.
To seek the truth.
Yeah.
Do you have percentages of,
And just repeat the question or, summarize. the
Oh, I can do
question.
that, yeah.
Yes.
do you know percentages of what the whales were used for, like fuel down to, I mean, how much really was consumed as food and how much was fuel and other, could you maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't have exact percentage. So the question is what
And
what percentage of whale products was used in which way? There were, I couldn't talk about percentages precisely because I never saw those figures in the Soviet archives, but the large majority of whale products went to make margarine. So I would say whale oil was 80 to 90% ended up as an edible fat, as a butter substitute. And that was true. That was true for every whaling country at the time. The Soviets, yeah, there were other things. They extracted vitamins from the vital organs. There were lubricants that were made of some of the lower grade oils or sperm oil. Sperm oil is a very different thing than baleen whale oil. But it was far and away the main product was margarine. Yeah.
Is your sense of it that they used most of the whale that they obtained?
Whether the Soviets used most of the whale that they obtained, there was a large degree of waste. I go into that in a lot of detail in the book. Um, there were certain motivations, incentives in the socialist workplace to overproduce. And also not to coordinate labor all that well. These were some of it was very much a sort of tempo-based incentive, record-breaking, kill as many whales as you possibly can. Can we process all those whales? Well, it doesn't matter for that group. They're rewarded for their production. So some people call it a productivist society, just overwhelmingly focused on production with the idea that there really can't be enough. Now, I don't think it was that simple, right? There was an ecological awareness in the Soviet Union as well. There was a lot of waste for these reasons and more. The Soviets also, especially initially, were not that used to whaling, and especially the rendering of whales was a complex process that required a lot of technological know-how and coordination. And some of the figures that I read there would be about 2 fin whales every year just wasted. And that's merely from the ship back to port. The number of whales killed that were too rotten by the time they were retrieved or were never retrieved, that's another question altogether. It's safe to say there was enormous wastage in the Soviet industry, but the Soviets were probably not entirely unique in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They preserve the whales, like it was long voyages, presumably, right?
Yeah, I mean, once you've boiled them down into an oil, and all the parts of the whale, including the bones, by the 50s were being rendered into oil. The oil was stable. Now, meat was another question, and there was a market for meat in the Soviet Union, not a very good one, but in Japan, increasingly in the 1970s. A lot of whale meat was sold to the Japanese, or sometimes to Africa, sometimes to Western Europe too, and that was a much bigger problem. That would, you could catch, slaughter, process whales, and then in the Antarctic, where it's very cold, but you had to cross the equator to get back to the Soviet Union. And there's numerous accounts of just it all just getting totally rotten in the equatorial regions because when the refrigerators failed and things like that. Yeah.
So they weren't hauling carcasses back. It happened
They process.
because of
All-
machinery.
yes.
Okay.
Exactly. So I showed you that. I probably have a better
That's
picture.
like in a fleet,
Mhm.
you said there was a request for 7.
Yep.
That I imagine that counts as a processing ship,
Yep.
like a mothership,
Mothership, exactly. Floating factories.
with a bunch
is
of
what they were
little
called.
Petra boats running around,
That's right.
right? So a fleet would be not one big main
Uh-huh.
processing plant, and then 12 to 20
That's right.
fishing or killer boats around it, right?
Catcher boats. Yeah, exactly
Wow.
right.
And then were the products then stored on the processing boat? Because I mean, there's got to be a limit.
Yeah.
I mean, how much can I store
And they
before
were,
I have to go to port to unload if I didn't have like
Mhm.
some kind of a transporter that would take the product?
and that's exactly what they did. Ships would come down from Russia, unload,
Offload,
offload,
okay.
depending on how the season was going, go back to Russia.
Oh,
You
okay.
can imagine the expenses that are involved
Oh, yeah.
in this. Just the fuel. I mean, you can't get farther away from the Antarctic than Russia.
Yeah,
Mm,
the other end of the world.
And there were whaling in the North Pacific as well, but the 80%.
I had a question about
Yeah,
the
Rick.
statistics of like
Yep.
the actual and reported,
Mhm.
but the fin whale number is fascinating to me. So I'm wondering, the blue whale is so big. I'm wondering if they were misidentifying fin whales and blue whales so that they were actually taking fin whales but calling them blues.
Mhm.
Do you think? I
There
mean,
were some of
because
the-
why are those two numbers so
Mhm.
just weird?
Yeah, and in some fin whales are a case in point, the Soviets would actually exaggerate the numbers that they caught, right? And that was complicated. You have to know a little bit about the history of the International Whaling Commission, but there was a point, especially in the 50s, where it was clear that quotas were going to be divided up between countries, right? that was just the way, that was the way everyone figured the only chance we're gonna have of regulating this, and the only way that companies would sign on. Soviets, of course, were state-run. Whaling venture, Norwegians weren't, they were private companies. The Japanese were somewhere in between. The British were running private companies, so were the South Africans. So the Soviets knew a national quota was coming up and they wanted to get a larger percentage of it. And so they claimed whales that they hadn't actually killed to exaggerate. So even before they were killing illegal whales, there was a culture of deceit at the International Whaling Commission, for complicated reasons.
Oh, we got all kinds of hands.
Oh, I love it. They got a Sea Shepherd t-shirt over there too.
ACS told Sea Shepherds about the Kita, so that's.
Is that right? The
ACS got the boats in the water.
Sea Shepherd landed on Siberia shores in 1983.
Yeah.
To protest the Soviets.
The Kita program. The Witness is a Whale. Are you familiar with that group?
I am.
Are you?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's why you look so familiar. Because we showed it a couple of years ago at our conference.
I'd like to see it again.
You can. It's on our website.
It is.
If anybody wants to see the film about
So-
this,
Great,
it's on our
great.
website.
So you had the scientists too, which is the couple that married.
Phil and Yulia. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. They gave a talk down here.
They were at our conference.
Oh, they're on your panel.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. That's right. That's right. And Phil and Yulia, I should say, as was probably obvious, were really helpful to me.
Good.
Yulia did a lot of the sort of compilation of statistics.
The secret research.
Yeah, exactly. And Nick and Cheryl were also very helpful. They shared some of their interview transcripts with me, so I really appreciated that.
Nice.
So how did they verify the amount of whales that were being captured? I mean, 150,000's big number. Did he actually go to the sites where they were going to import, especially because they leak carcasses?
Mm-hmm. So, sorry, what do you mean? How did who verify it? How did who verify the numbers?
How do you determine exactly how many whales are being caught?
Uh-huh. Well, so there was a system on board, a so-called whale passport system. There was an inspector on board every whale ship. Every time a whale was killed, they filled out all the data of a whale passport, sort of, I guess, passport to the beyond for this poor whale. What sex, what size, what state of pregnancy, if any, is there a fetus on there? So, this is very common, of course. So there is a sort of direct attestation to each kill. Are they 100% accurate? Probably not, but they're, there's pretty robust record keeping.
Like a form for each one.
That's right. Yeah.
But they hit them.
Who did they?
You've worked at the National Bureau of Whaling Statistics. So the International Whaling, which was then under the International Whaling Commission, and there were various reasons. So in the 1950s, you had to report your kills until the quota was reached. So you telegraph them in, and then the IWC would say season's done, right? The kills have been reached. So there were robust systems. Easily falsifiable, but there were, accounting for whales killed was very important for the international regulation of whales. U.S. was not whaling, except coastal whaling, which was not regulated in the same way. So the U.S. wasn't sending ships down to the Antarctic, and that was really the primary concern of the International Whaling Commission. Which is not to say that coastal whaling and shore whaling didn't have an impact as well. It certainly did. Probably not in the US all that much, but it certainly did in places like Australia, especially South Africa, where whaling was pretty intense from shore stations. Yeah.
50s, 60s and all that with the IWC. Were
Uh-huh.
those whaling countries or non-whaling countries that were
Yeah.
heading the IWC? way back?
Founded by whaling countries, but increasingly non-whaling countries were being represented in the IWC, not in the 50s and 60s so much, in the 1970s. There was
Earlier, there
yeah.
were more maybe whaling
almost exclusively. I mean, that was the idea, was that you had to have an interest in whaling to be a part of it. And so the role of the U.S. was always a little bit, sorry, this is getting kind of far afield from the Soviets, but the role of the U.S. was always a little bit curious, right? Because we weren't really whaling
Yeah.
in any large numbers after the Second World War, and yet played a pretty important role at the International Whaling Commission, which not everyone was that happy about. So, yeah. Well, yeah, it's a good question. I need it. And I'm not Russian. I probably need some psychoanalysis done. But I can say concretely that I visited Russia in 1995 when it was in the midst of its flourishing of democracy and economic breakdown. Those two came together at that time, and I was really interested in the place. And so I decided to learn the language and move there, and decided that I was super fascinated in Russian history, and I wrote my first book about Russians in Alaska, mostly Alaska and Siberia and the fur trade. And then it was, I remember kayaking off the coast of Kodiak Island and being surrounded by humpbacks one day, and just thinking, wow, there's like, I was pretty obvious, right? But whales are incredibly interesting, fascinating, massive creatures. I'd never been that close to them before. And then it was not that long after that where I read the first accounts of this kind of this falsification, the Soviet falsification, which I by no means discovered. But I thought, like these these interests are really coming together for me. And the fact that, my home state played a role in this whole history, to be able to tell the other side was kind of irresistible to me, and also satisfying, like we share this ocean. We should know the other side. It impacted our lives here too. On the coast of California, in Hawaii. Hawaii starts a whale watching group in the 1950s, and they're shut down in 1963. Why? All the humpbacks are gone. Why? Because the Soviets killed them all between 1961 and 1964 in Alaska as part of the same. So it seemed to me, that our history is connected in really important ways, actually, with the Russia's history, and so that felt like a a really satisfying place to be able to try to tell that story to myself and others. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
All right, Jane, you got any closing comments? We'll take another.
Carol's had her hand up for a long time.
Go ahead. Go ahead. No, please.
Yeah.
And you're the one person who might be able to.
Oh, I hope I can now.
Was there a Russian indigenous community that did any whaling similar to what's on the other side over here?
It depends on what you mean by Russian, I guess, right? So certainly indigenous people who were conquered by the Russian Empire, say the Chukchi, Koryaks in Kamchatka, they hunted whales. So yes, in fact, there were.
So up until how long, and were they absorbed and became part of the whole Russian state, or was that
Yeah.
how?
So different times for different people, but Chukotka, the Chukchi, they're close relatives with Inupiat in northern Alaska, right? Really became part of the Russian state after the Bolshevik Revolution, although they were formally part of the Russian Empire from the 1600s. They were not really, I mean, no one convinced them that they were part of the Russian state until the 1920s, basically. And they continued to whale on their own until maybe it's in the book, but I may get this date wrong, until 1968, when the Soviet state said, indigenous whaling is too wasteful. We need to take over for it. And so they sent a catcher boat up to Chukotka and started catching gray whales and gray whales exclusively by that point, and delivering them to villages, and also using, actually most of the meat ended up going for mink farms, which is why Sea Shepherd landed on the coast of Chukotka in 1981. Sorry, Greenpeace followed up 2 years later in 83. and waged a very ineffective protest against indigenous whaling actually up there. It's a fascinating story, which I have another article about because it's sort of the beginning of the split of one of the splits between Greenpeace and Sea Shepherd. Anyway, that's for another day.
And the book's available on
Everywhere.
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 So get the book.
Yeah.
Reading club, ACS reading club
There you
for
go.
the month.
There you go.
No, go ahead. I didn't know you're sitting behind me. I can't see you.
I knew Alexei Yablokov.
Yeah.
Back in the day, he had a lot of data on whaling of smaller species. So you went down your list there, but they were actually taking killer whales in the Antarctic in large numbers back at that time. Do you know anything about that period? Was this just we'll catch and kill everything, or?
Killer whale hunt was an experimental hunt, which by the way wasn't regulated by the IWC, so it technically at least wasn't illegal. They killed, I think, 900 killer whales one summer down there to see if they could make a profit out of them, or at least make something useful out of them. And they decided no, like everyone else. Basically, whoever's tried to kill killer whales, it's just the fat content. It's not usable. So whether there was more killing of killer whales doesn't appear in the records. It's possible, right? But there wouldn't have been any real reason to falsify killer whale numbers as unsavory as their killing was. Certainly belugas. Belugas was where Yablokov got his start studying. His first book, I think his dissertation was on belugas in the North Pacific. So yeah, he was very interested in smaller cetaceans. May have been one of the reasons why he was so passionate about whales too, since obviously toothed whales are easy to fall in love with.
Well, and the thing is that he was heavily, there was a joint US-USSR program. What, early 1970s, somewhere in there, that he participated in, and we were always amazed that he was allowed to do that.
I'm so envious you got to meet Yablokov. I never met him. I know a few people in this room have, and seemed like a real Renaissance man. Yeah, a giant in all sorts of ways, right? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Paul Watson told me when I interviewed him down here on a boat in San Diego too one time. The Yablokov. What's that?
He was one of our speakers.
He was one of your speakers too. Paul's obviously a great speaker. He told me the Yablokov had told him about some of the illegal whaling, which I don't think before 75, because Watson was on that voyage, of course, that Greenpeace voyage. But may have been. He told him, I think, it helped inspire his 81 voyage up to Lorino. It was hard for me. I mean, Paul's listening. I don't think so. It's hard for me to pin him down exactly. Paul didn't really remember exactly where and when that happened. May have been. I'm not exactly sure, but who might have doubt Paul Watson? Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks. All right.